Right now, at the bottom of America's largest reservoir, the top of a pump intake valve that was built to stay hidden underwater is sitting exposed to open air. That single detail tells you almost everything you need to know about what's happening to Lake Mead. A machine designed as a last resort is now operating in daylight, because the lake has fallen further and faster than the people who built it ever wanted to admit was possible. This is the story of a $1.5 billion bet that one desert city made 2 decades ago, when almost nobody else believed the reservoir feeding the American Southwest could ever really run dry. It's the story of a tunnel drilled beneath the floor of a lake while millions of tons of water pressed down from above. And it's the story of a piece of 1920s paperwork that promised more water than the Colorado River has ever reliably carried, a debt that is now coming due in real time, on our watch, in 2026. To understand why Las Vegas built what it built, you first have to understand what Hoover Dam actually is, and how much of the modern Southwest was constructed on top of a single assumption about a river that never quite behaved the way anyone hoped. In 1931, in the depths of the Great Depression, the federal government committed to one of the most audacious engineering projects in American history. The Colorado River had spent generations flooding violently in spring and running nearly dry by late summer, a river too unpredictable to build a civilization around. The Bureau of Reclamation chose a site in Black Canyon, on the border of Nevada and Arizona, and set out to tame it. More than 5,000 workers labored in canyon heat that regularly passed 120 degrees, living in a town called Boulder City that had been built from nothing just to house them. Over 5 years they poured more than 3 million cubic yards of concrete, and when the dam was finished in 1936, it stood 726 feet tall, the largest concrete structure human hands had ever built. Behind it, the water backed up 112 miles into the desert, forming Lake Mead, a reservoir capable of holding enough water to supply every household in the country for well over a decade. What Hoover Dam created wasn't just electricity and irrigation. It created the modern Southwest. Cities like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles grew to sizes that would have been physically impossible without the water and power flowing out of that one structure in the rock. When the dam was completed, Las Vegas was a town of roughly 8,000 people. Today its metro area holds more than 2 million, and it still draws the overwhelming majority of its drinking water directly from the lake Hoover created. But the entire system was built on top of a number that never actually existed. In November of 1922, representatives from 7 states gathered in Santa Fe and signed the Colorado River Compact, dividing the river's water between the upper basin states of Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states of Arizona, Nevada, and California, with a later treaty granting an additional share to Mexico. Altogether, the compact promised roughly 16.5 million acre-feet of water every year, in perpetuity. The trouble was, the negotiators had based that promise on river flow measurements taken between 1906 and 1929, one of the wettest stretches in the Colorado's recorded history. They mistook a fluke for a baseline. Longer-term climate records, including tree ring data reaching back centuries, put the river's real average flow closer to 13.5 million acre-feet a year, and in the 21st century, actual flows have often run well below even that. Every year, the paperwork promises water that the river simply does not have. For 2 decades, that gap has been covered by draining Lake Mead itself. The decline has been steady and largely one-directional. The lake sat near 1,200 feet above sea level in the year 2000. It slipped below 1,150 by 2004, below 1,100 by 2010, and by 2016 it had fallen far enough to trigger the first formal federal shortage warnings. In 2021, it crossed the threshold that forced the Bureau of Reclamation to declare a formal Tier 1 shortage, cutting Arizona's allocation by nearly a fifth, along with smaller cuts to Nevada and Mexico. Then in 2022, the lake bottomed out at just over 1,040 feet, its lowest level since the reservoir was first filled in the 1930s, a low that exposed sunken boats, a World War II-era landing craft, and human remains that had been hidden beneath the surface for decades. Every tier below that gets more severe. Below roughly 1,035 feet, 12 of Hoover Dam's 17 turbines can no longer generate meaningful power at all, a nearly 70% collapse in the dam's output. At 950 feet, the lake reaches what engineers call minimum power pool, the point where water can no longer reach the turbine intakes and the dam stops producing electricity entirely. And at 895 feet lies the threshold with the ominous name, dead pool, the elevation at which water can no longer pass through the dam at all by gravity. Below dead pool, nothing flows downstream. Arizona, California, Mexico, and the tribal nations along the river all lose their supply simultaneously. This is the reality Las Vegas started preparing for while much of the rest of the basin was still hoping the drought would break. In 2005, facing the prospect of a shrinking lake, the Southern Nevada Water Authority approved construction of a third intake, budgeted at $812 million, designed to draw water from far deeper in the reservoir than the original two pipes ever could. Construction began in 2008, and what followed was, according to tunneling engineers, one of the most technically demanding underground projects completed anywhere in the world that decade. Crews bored a tunnel roughly 3 miles long and more than 20 feet in diameter through solid rock, mixed soil, and pressurized groundwater beneath the floor of an active reservoir, with nothing but rock and water above their heads for the entire length of the dig. The finished intake structure, anchored to the lake bottom with more than 1,000 truckloads of concrete, began drawing water in September of 2015. But there was a catch. That third intake initially shared pumping equipment with the older system, which limited how low it could actually reach. So the Water Authority built a dedicated low lake-level pumping station, completed in 2020 and switched on in April of 2022, at almost the exact moment falling water rendered one of the original pumping stations useless. Together, the third intake and the new pumping station allow Southern Nevada to draw water from roughly 875 feet above sea level, 20 feet below the dead pool line itself. In practical terms, that means if Lake Mead ever falls low enough to cut off Arizona, California, and Mexico completely, Las Vegas can still, in theory, keep pulling water from what remains of the lake. That infrastructure came alongside decades of aggressive conservation. Nevada's entire annual allocation from the Colorado River is a small fraction of what Arizona or California receive, and agriculture across the Southwest consumes the overwhelming majority of the river's water, not desert cities. Since the early 2000s, Southern Nevada has paid residents to tear out ornamental grass that served no purpose beyond appearance, removing hundreds of millions of square feet of turf and saving tens of billions of gallons of water in the process. Nearly all the water used indoors in Las Vegas is treated and returned to the lake, meaning the city's net consumption from the Colorado stays close to its legal limit even as its population has grown by hundreds of thousands of people. As John Fleck, a University of New Mexico water researcher and author of 2 books on the Colorado River, has put it, Las Vegas built the physical and institutional infrastructure to survive a shrinking lake, even as uncertainty continues to hang over the rest of the river system. None of that changes what's happening upstream. The winter of 2025 into 2026 brought a record-low snowpack to the Rocky Mountains, followed by an early spring heat wave that burned off much of the little runoff there was before it could reach the rivers below. Lake Powell, which sits above Lake Mead and depends on that same snowmelt, dropped faster than federal projections had anticipated. Facing a choice between protecting Glen Canyon Dam's own hydropower and sending more water downstream to Lake Mead, the Department of the Interior chose to hold water back in Powell, cutting the release into Mead for the year by roughly 1.48 million acre-feet. Officials acknowledged the decision could accelerate Lake Mead's decline and threaten a significant reduction in Hoover Dam's power output as early as the following fall. By June of 2026, Lake Mead had slipped below 1,050 feet, a level low enough to put it on a trajectory that federal forecasters say could carry it past its 2022 record low within a year. Some projections released by the Bureau of Reclamation have placed the lake's most probable elevation at around 1,020 feet by the summer of 2027, more than 20 feet beneath the previous record. At the same time, the 7 basin states have continued struggling to agree on a long-term framework to replace the interim operating rules that expire at the end of 2026, with the lower basin states proposing to leave more water in the system through 2028 while the upper basin states have not signed on. Every short-term extension negotiated over the past 20 years has bought time without closing the underlying gap between what the river delivers and what a 100-year-old document says it owes. Meanwhile, engineers keep pushing to keep the system running as long as possible. In 2026, the Bureau of Reclamation moved forward with tens of millions of dollars in spending on new wide-head turbines for Hoover Dam, designed to keep generating power at water levels that would have shut the original 1930s-era turbines down completely, extending the dam's usefulness closer to that 950-foot minimum power pool line. It's a striking parallel to what Las Vegas did years earlier with its third intake. Two separate engineering answers to the same falling lake, one keeping the water flowing to homes, the other keeping the lights on. Neither one adds a single new drop of water to the Colorado River. Both simply buy time against a decline that conservation, infrastructure, and negotiation have so far only managed to slow, never reverse. The farmers in central Arizona have already felt what that slowdown looks like in practice, watching fields that had grown cotton, alfalfa, and winter vegetables for generations sit fallow as allocations from the Central Arizona Project Canal shrink year after year. California, protected by senior water rights, has so far avoided mandatory cuts entirely, though officials on all sides understand that if the lake ever falls far enough to reach that state's threshold, the resulting dispute could dwarf every water conflict the American West has seen before it. And Mexico, entitled to water under a 1944 treaty with no backup system of its own, has the least room to absorb what comes next. What makes this story different from an ordinary infrastructure headline is the timescale it's unfolding on. This isn't a hypothetical crisis decades away. The lake has fallen roughly 6 to 7 feet a year on average across the past 2 decades, and the distance remaining before it reaches dead pool is now being measured in years, not centuries, contingent almost entirely on how much snow falls in the Rocky Mountains in the winters ahead, and on whether 7 states, several tribal nations, and a neighboring country can agree to take less water than a 1922 document says they're owed. Las Vegas built the most direct answer. Any single city on the river has given to that uncertainty, a tunnel bored beneath an entire reservoir, reaching for water below the point where everyone else's supply runs out. It is remarkable engineering, and it may well keep one city's taps running long after its neighbors don't. But it was never a fix for the river itself. It was a way of surviving a problem that infrastructure alone can't solve, because the real shortfall isn't underground, in a tunnel or a pump station. It's in the sky, in the snowpack, in a compact signed more than a century ago that measured a wet decade and called it normal. The lake's white bathtub ring, stretching more than 100 feet up the canyon walls, is simply the most visible marker of that reckoning, a line between the river everyone was promised and the river that actually exists. Whether the Southwest can close that gap, or simply keep building deeper straws to reach whatever's left, is the question that's still being answered, one dry winter at a time.